Hello and welcome to all of you to this webinar on the sidelines of the 49th session of Human Rights Council organized by Kashmir Institute of International Relations and World Muslim Congress. The topic of today's webinar is Unravelling the Colonialism of Indian Colonialism in Occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And we have been discussing this topic for a long, at least the last 2.5 years. The steps the government of India has taken after the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A in Indian occupied Kashmir in order to annex the Indian occupied Kashmir and Indianize its population. The major steps which were taken after the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A was the new domicile law, which gives permission to the Indian nationals to own the land in Kashmir, to have the employment in Kashmir and many other amenities in Kashmir. And along with that, the state was dismembered into union territories, and also we have many laws like Land Revenue Act changing that in order to grab the land of Kashmir, and also the high officials and the government machinery, Kashmiri Muslims were removed from those posts, and all those posts are now owned by the Indians. And the government of India has also taken steps to change the history, the identity and culture of Indian occupied Kashmir by its new education policy, by making Urdu as Hindi as this official language instead of Urdu, and many more, like media policy, silencing, criminalizing the media, and also silencing human rights defenders. And now the delimitation of assembly segments in order to have the number game of non-Muslims in the assembly of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And last but not least, which we have seen most recently, the revival of the village defense committees, along with now the cinema of India is also being used again to criminalize and to facilitate the persecution of Kashmiri Muslims in India. We will be discussing this all. For this, we have a very renowned panel. I have with me Mr. Robert Katana. He is an author, an activist, and a journalist working for peace and social justice. He serves on the board of Canadian Voices for Palestinian Rights, World Beyond War, and Canadian for Peace and Justice in Kashmir. He is the author of several books, including The Station and the American Soldiers, 1776-2006, Empire, Racism, Genocide, A History of U.S. Foreign Policy, Propaganda, Lies and False Flag, How the U.S. Justifies its Wars, Look Not into the Marrow, a Vietnam Era and Interwar. Additionally, a compilation of his writings on Palestine has been published as Occupied Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. and International Law. He is a book reviewer for the New York Journal of Books. He has spoken about the human rights in such diverse places: Washington, D.C., Shannon, Ireland, and Tehran, Iran. He has also written a book which will be shortly in public domain on the settler colonialism in Palestine and Kashmir. So and we have been joined by Sayyid Muhammad Ali, Director CAS. He is a national security expert in Pakistan. We have with me Mr. Ahmed Qureshi, a veteran journalist, Executive Director, Youth Forum for Kashmir, and an analyst on Kashmir and Middle East. I have with me Mr. Uwais Wasi. Dr. Uwais Wasi is the Dean of Social Sciences at Refa University, and Dr. Vikas Ali Kausar is currently the head of Department of Public Policy in the Namral University. To start with, I'll straight away go to Robert for his valuable remarks, because Robert has another meeting I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity of being here today on this important and distinguished panel. The topic we are discussing is of great importance. The Oxford Dictionary defines settler colonialism as follows. Settler colonialism is an ongoing system of power that perpetuates the genocide and repression of indigenous people and cultures. essentially hegemonic in scope. Settler colonialism normalizes the continuous settler occupation, exploiting lands and resources to which indigenous peoples have genealogical relationships. Settler colonialism includes interlocking forms of oppression, including racism, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. There can be no doubt that India is perpetrating settler colonialism on Kashmir. This particular brand of settler colonialism has its foundations in Hindutva. Journalist Sudha Ramachandran in June of 2020 described Hindutva, and her description is worth noting. And please excuse me if I mispronounce any of these names. Hindutva is a modern political ideology that views India as a Hindu nation and defines Indian culture in terms of Hindu cultural values. Its goal is to make India a Hindu state. In his 1923 treatise, Hindutva ideologue Vinayak Damodar Sarvarkar said that Hindus are the only true Indians, as their fatherland and holy land are in India. Muslims and Christians, however, could not be considered Indian, as their holy lands were not in India, but in far-off Arabia or Palestine. Sarvarkar's ideological successor, Madhav Sada Shiv Goldwalker, who was one of the founders of the RSS, said that the foreign races, that is, Muslims and Christians in India, must either adopt the Hindu culture and language, must learn to respect and hold in reverence Hindu religion, must lose their separate existence to merge in the Hindu race, or stay in the country wholly subordinated to the Hindu nation, claiming nothing, deserving no privileges, far less any preferential treatment, not even citizens' rights. Not even the basic rights of citizens. Settler colonialism hasn't changed much in centuries. The Roman historian Tacitus quoted the Caledonian chief Calgacus as follows: "To ravage, to slaughter, to usurp under false titles they call empire, and where they make a desert, they call it peace." Not only does the colonizer want to destroy and usurp, but the colonizer also colonizes the idea of peace itself. Of this violent colonization of peace in Kashmir, a Kashmiri scholar and a poet writes in verse, quote, "They want us to write in blood and only write of peace," close quote. That India is purporting to assist the people it is actually destroying was made clear numerous times, perhaps most blatantly by Harsh Vardhan Shringla, the Indian ambassador to the United States. In a column in the New York Times on September 19th, 2019, 6 weeks after the Indian abrogation of Article 370 of its constitution, he wrote in part this, quote, "The Kashmir region is now back on the road to progress and prosperity because the Indian government has repealed an anachronistic and temporary provision of law that has hindered development there," close quote. He, of course, makes no mention of the unspeakable oppression of the Kashmiri people and the Indian efforts to displace and marginalize the majority Muslim population. Settler colonialism, of course, includes the occupation of the victim nation. There are international laws defining occupation, what it means, its conditions, and the responsibilities of the occupying nation to the nation occupied. These laws also detail the rights of the occupied people. They are enshrined in the 1907 Hague Regulations and the Fourth Geneva Convention. Additional Protocol 1 and customary international humanitarian law also regulate occupation. I will not review all the articles here, but we'll mention a few of them. The first article says this: the occupant does not acquire sovereignty over the territory. Indian officials have declared that Kashmir is an integral part of India, and current unrest there is an internal problem and of no concern to the international community. Sadly, many nations seem to endorse this false view, including the United States, which, during President Donald Trump's chaotic presidency, blatantly stated it as fact. Article 2, occupation is only a temporary situation, and the rights of the occupant are limited to the extent of that period. By the Indian government stating clearly that Kashmir is a part of India, any thought of their intending a temporary situation cannot even be considered. Article 4 says the occupying power must take measures to restore and ensure, as far as possible, public order and safety. India's idea of ensuring order in Kashmir is in direct contradiction to ensuring safety. The people of Kashmir are barely able to leave their homes for fear of India's military and police. Today, Kashmir is the most militarized place in the world, with a ratio of 1 soldier for every 30 civilians. Article 8 says the transfers of the civilian population of the occupying power into the occupied territory, regardless whether forcible or voluntary, are prohibited. Following the abrogation of Article 37 of the Indian Constitution, anyone can now purchase property in Kashmir. Previously, only Kashmiris were able to do so. With this new policy, many more Indians are expected to move into Kashmir, altering drastically the demographic composition of the country and marginalizing what is currently a mainly Muslim population. Article 9, collective punishment is prohibited. As reported in the Wire staff on August 22nd of 2019, 5 human rights experts of the United Nations on Thursday called for India to lift the communications clampdown in Kashmir, describing the measure as a collective punishment for the entire population of the region. Article 11, reprisals against protected persons or their property are prohibited. Press personnel are considered protected persons under international law. Indian forces, immune from prosecution, harass and kill members of the press routinely. And lastly, Article 15, people accused of criminal offenses shall be provided with proceedings respecting internationally recognized judicial guarantees. For example, they must be informed of the reason for their arrest, charged with a specific offense, and given a fair trial as quickly as possible. Thousands of Kashmiris are held indefinitely by India without charge or access to lawyers or family members. This is settler colonialism. This is how India today is brutally victimizing the people of the nation of Kashmir, while most of the world's governments simply look the other way. They care more about power and profits than human rights or international law. The people of Kashmir have suffered for decades, and that suffering has increased drastically since August of 2019. We have a solemn obligation to act in their behalf because for them, the very act of acting in their own interest can cause their immediate death or long-term incarceration. We who are able to speak for them must do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for your valuable input. We'd like to have you in future webinars also. Your valuable inputs always encourage us, and hopefully the audience at large will benefit from this. I will straight away go now to Dr. Uwais bin Wasi, who is the Dean at the Faculty of Social Sciences, Rifa International University, Islamabad. Dr. Wasi, you have the floor. Unmute yourself, Wasi sir. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Ilta Bani Saab, Kashmir Institute of International Relations, to give me an opportunity to share my thoughts on this subject, unraveling colonial practices in occupied Kashmir. As theoretically, my predecessor speaker has already mentioned the definition and some of the practices of colonialism. I just would like to draw your attention towards a book written by Dr. Shashi Tharoor, current member parliament and India's former external minister. He has very recently written a groundbreaking book, Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India, in which it lays bare the colonizing practices employed by Britain. So instead of talking about the scholars of colonialism like Edward Said or Gayatri Spivak or Ziauddin Sardar or other people, they have extensively worked on colonialism. I think that the relevant example is the person, a politician, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, to draw parallels between the colonial practices which he discussed in his book are being employed in Indian occupied Kashmir. The first thing that he mentioned, and I can draw parallel in Indian occupied Kashmir, is that in colonialism, the colonial power acquires full or partial political control over another country, territory, or state. So in this way, we can say that the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, that is an internationally recognized disputed territory. And India herself is a signatory to this document, which considers it a dispute. Even the document of instrument of accession, which India presents, that also is a conditional, that is also provisional and subject to the ratification of the wish of the people, that has to be ascertained through an independent and UN supervised plebiscite. So in this context of the state or territory, the way India extends its control, political control, military control, that is the occupation. And that is a parallel we can draw from British colonialism to India and Indian new colonialism to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Second thing, second parallel that we can draw is the practices which have been employed by the Britishers to perpetuate its occupation of the Indian subcontinent, in Africa and other parts of the world. India imposed almost the similar laws to perpetuate its occupation as the British colonizers they did in India. Some of the laws we have been discussing, and different seminars and discussions, there are these black laws have some similarity with those laws employed there. Third parallel, which also discussed by Dr. Tharoor in that book, that is the use of force and a horrendous massacre that took place. For example, Jallianwala Bagh massacre, some people call it Amritsar massacre, in which number of people got killed. India did a number of such heart-wrenching and horrendous massacres. Poshpura massacre, in which over 100 women, including the 80-year-old women, were gang raped. The women of the whole village were dragged out of their places during the biting winter nights of the valley during the operation. And Indian military had molested several Kashmiri women. There is another massacre of 1990 that is linked to this one. That after that incident of this Kunan Poshpura massacre, a large number of protesters, they took out in different parts of the valley, and they staged at Gawakadal Bridge a demonstration demanding action against the perpetrator of the incident. But that demonstration was quelled by the brute use of force by the Central Reserve Police Force, leaving 52 people dead. And at least 100 people had been killed on the Gawakadal Bridge in the heart of Srinagar. People had been killed in broad daylight on that bridge, and their bullet-torn bodies either heaped up on the polished grey macadam of the bridge or thrown into the backs of CRPF trucks. So these things are documented by writers on Kashmir, by recent novelists also, and some other reports. They also documented these massacres which happen in Indian occupied Kashmir. There is another parallel that we can see in Kashmir, that is its economy that has been destroyed largely because the agriculture sector that is very critical to the economy of Jammu and Kashmir. And I came across the figure that 100 billion rupees, 1.3 billion rupees per year, that is the revenue per annum, and is the main livelihood for millions of people there. The region this state also contributes 3/4 of India's total apple production of 1.8 million to 2 million tons per year. On the one hand, due to this securitization of the erstwhile state and some other measures, punitive measures, and blockade, lockdown, the production, particularly this apple production, is heavily compromised. And on the other hand, instead of India buying Kashmiri apple, it had substantially increased its apple import from Iran and Afghanistan, drastically compromising India's, Kashmir's economy. Apart from these, some of the cultural things which we can also say, also see in Indian-occupied Kashmir, some of the points, Vanisab, you have already mentioned in your initial remarks about this language replacement of Urdu with Hindi, and change of this script, Kashmiri script, into Devanagari. And at one time, this Fairan was prohibited in public secretariat in Jammu and Kashmir, and a lot more cultural measures have been taken by Indian colonial forces. And last but not the least, that now the territory, the land, is controlled by a viceroy-like figure, that is Lieutenant Governor, who is ruling Kashmir without having any institution, without having any assembly, without having any democratic institution over there. So these are some of the parallels which I can see in Indian-occupied Kashmir, and they are already discussed. Why I have chosen that study, that book, to draw your attention, to draw the attention of the participants here, that it's none other than the Indians, not only an average Indian, but an erudite, a person who was trying to grab the slot of Secretary General of the United Nations, Dr. Sashi Tharoor I'm alluding to. So this is his opinion. So if that was true for Britishers, it is equally true to Indian. From all intent and purposes, from all definitions, this is the colonial policy and the colonial practices which have been employed by India. So with these words, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vasi. You rightly pointed out that India has taken over the military control, the political control in Kashmir, strangulation of economic activities in Kashmir, and also the way they carried out the massacres in Kashmir and other things. And you rightly draw the parallels between the British colonialism in subcontinent and the Indian colonialism in Kashmir. Now I will give floor to Dr. Syed Muhammad Ali. Syed Muhammad Ali is a well-known international policy analyst. He has rich experience of high-level multilateral and bilateral negotiation on strategic nuclear security issues with US, China, and India. He works on foreign security, nuclear, and energy policies. Ms. Muhammad Ali has also written a book. One of his famous books includes the Booking Arms Control and Non-Proliferation series, Non-Proliferation Review, and Bulletin on Atomic Science. He also teaches at National Defense University, for instance, airborne policy, frequently writes and appears on different national and international television channels for opinion analysis. Dr. Syed Muhammad Ali, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Altasab, for honoring me with your well-considered and thoughtful invitation and this very timely initiative. on the sidelines of the session at UN Human Rights Council. I think your efforts and also that of your very respected and influential forum are very important in order to internationally make the world aware of the reality of Kashmir. And I think the speakers who spoke before me have comprehensively covered the grave and tragic realities which is apparent inside the IIOJK. So I'll not repeat that. What I'll try to explain in the next 6-7 minutes is not only what is going on in IIOJK, which has been adequately covered, but how and why India has been successfully hiding this reality by shaping the world perceptions as part of its diplomacy, as part of its information, strategic communication and information policy, in order to present itself as a land of opportunity rather than extremist oppressor of the Muslim majority in IIOJK. So when you talk about the colonization of Kashmir, it is not possible for India, and that is my central argument, gentlemen. It is not possible for India to carry on the brutalities and the oppression and the mass killings and all the human rights violations inside the territory of IIOJK unless it successfully diverts the world attention away from it and legitimizes it through a very comprehensive, well-resourced and long-term diplomatic and information strategy. So what is the key ingredient of that? Because that is very important for the international community in general, but UN Human Rights Council in particular to know, because it has been using its fake narratives, its information strategy and misleading diplomacy to mislead the international community, but also feed false information regarding the real situation in IIOJK at the prestigious and important forums like UN Human Rights Council, by denying it the access to what's going on, but also feeding in wrong information and fake narratives. I think it has been adequately covered. Let me conceptualize what has earlier been said. I think there are 5 domains in which this colonization of Kashmir is afoot. There is an economic dimension, there is a political dimension, there is a security dimension, there is a cultural dimension, and there is a psychological dimension. In terms of political dimension, what happened in 5th August 2019 is in the political domain, that actually depriving the Kashmiri people from the UN recognized status and the rights that the Indian Constitution under Article 370 itself provides them. Secondly is the economic, and I think some very important arguments have already been made, is the economic deprivation of the Kashmiri people from the and also depriving them of the opportunity to improve their quality of life, earn a respectful living in order to ensure their welfare. The third is the security dimension, and I think it goes without saying that Kashmir is perhaps the most militarized conflict zone in the world, and the ratio of population to soldier is perhaps 1:10. So I don't think, and let me relate it to the recently held OIC Foreign Minister Conference in Islamabad, that much attention and debate focuses traditionally on Palestine, but it has been my considered and consistent effort to highlight the reality which is often not noticed and appreciated by the international community, that the gravity and the criticality of the Kashmir issue is far more than that of Palestine for 4 specific reasons. I think the population of IIOJK is more than twice than that of Palestine. There are more lives at stake. The area under occupation is much larger. So territorially and geographically, it is a bigger issue. Third, the number of casualties, I think there is no comparison. The number of people who have lost their lives as a direct consequence of state oppression and brutality, in contrast to the very highly publicized media exploitation and human rights violation in Palestine, I think there is no comparison. More than 100,000 people losing their life over the last 32 years, and a few hundred people losing their life in Palestine. The fourth dimension is the fact that both India and Pakistan are nuclear armed countries. So any escalation can, pose a specter or threat which will have global consequences. In case of Israel, it has no country which is willing to militarily challenge Israel's brutality or oppression of the Palestinian people. And so these things need to be seen in the context that the world community must realize that the criticality, the degree and the scope and the scale of human rights violations and tragedy is much more. So that brings me to the last point, that it is up to the Kashmiris and Pakistani people, international diaspora, think tanks, very eminent expert and activists like yourself, Mr. Wani, to bring out these facts convincingly, regularly, logically, and interestingly through their writings, through your activities, through your events. Not just in Islamabad, but it is very important. Let me urge you to, hold these events more regularly in Geneva, so that the misperceptions that the strategic communication efforts and initiatives like Disinfo Lab, which was a 15-year-long strategic communication project involving more than 700 websites in more than 100 countries, the impact, the influence it has had psychologically and diplomatically in feeding fake narratives into the UN system, particularly the UN Human Rights Council, needs to be challenged, needs to be corrected. And I think it is very important. I mentioned this to Pakistan's Minister of State for Information as well in one of my speeches recently, that most people who talk about the security of South Asia, they compare Pakistan and Indian defense budgets, that there is a ratio of 1:7 or 1:8. But I asked Pakistan's Minister of State for Information that, do you know what is the ratio of India and Pakistan's information budget? How will we highlight Kashmir more successfully, more convincingly, unless we have a adequate and proportionate investment and effort, not just political commitment, to highlight this, the realities, the brutal, the tragic realities of the Kashmiri in front of the international community. It is very important. These occasional seminars and marches and some protests are useful, but not adequate, not sufficient. They need to be done more frequently, but at an international level through more sophisticated means. Like I will expect, and I'll also recommend Altaf Saab, your very effective work in regularly monitoring the human rights violation and preparing a database which is increasingly respected and cited in the international media is very important. So such efforts need to be synergized and coordinated with prestigious international think tanks, academia, and more often should be done, so that the international community is warned that what is happening in Kashmir is not just a human rights issue, but poses a grave threat to the international peace and security, because it is being occupied by the only extremist organization which is leading the second largest country in the world, but is also in possession of one of the largest and fastest growing nuclear arsenals in the world. So the opportunities that India is misleadingly presenting before the international community as a land of opportunity needs to be corrected. The international community needs to be warned that for having false expectations of strategic cooperation, alliance building, and a large economic market are unrealistic, because the political instability, the marginalization and exploitation of minorities within India itself, and the frequent attempts by the BJP government to divert the international and domestic attention away from its misgovernance and mismanagement of COVID crisis and economy by trying irresponsible and dangerous activities like surgical strikes and missile launches, which they have called accidental, need to be brought out before the world. And lastly, that the international community, Wani Saab, owes it to the Kashmiri people, because Kashmir represents the final frontier as a challenge, as a test case for the international community, for the international institutions, that those who want the developing world in particular and the international community in general to trust that the promise of peace, progress, and prosperity and conflict resolution that these institutions have made to the international community, I think they need to live up to this promise, because if they don't, the current tumultuous international world order transformations might force the developing countries, because if these disputes are not timely and adequately and peacefully resolved, then I think the international community and the developing world in particular will lose their trust in these institutions and might lead to the emergence of alternative systems and institutions which might challenge the popularity and credibility of the status quo institutions and powers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sayyid Muhammad Ali Sahab. You brought very important and pertinent points to the discussion, and especially there is economic, political, security, cultural, and nuclear issues related to the Kashmir. And where your points are well taken, we have been doing it at the international level, but unfortunately, due to COVID, we were forced to resort to this online platform. And it was good, and thanks to this technology, even these times, we were able to reach out to our friends at international level like Robert and many others who participate in our earlier webinars from all across the globe and put forward their viewpoint. You were correctly that the narrative which India has been perpetuating for so long, like that this info lab which uncovered, whereas Ahmed is a witness to it, we uncovered this way back, but nobody listened to us. We asked that how India is creating a false narrative, how they are doing, how they have managed these false websites and all these things to discredit Pakistan as well as the Kashmir's freedom struggle at international level. But hopefully we will carry out work, whatever we can do. And inshallah in June, we will be in Geneva to have in-person seminars over there on these issues and will enlighten the international community and will keep on hammering their conscience in order to give some thought to the situation in occupied Kashmir and the situation which is emerging in this region. Thank you very much for your relevant input. I will go now to Dr. Vikas Ali Kausar. Dr. Vikas Ali Kausar is head of department currently at the Policy and Governance Department of National University of Modern Language, Islamabad. Dr. Vikas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Wani Saab, for your generous introduction, particularly the last part. I guess much is covered, the ground has been covered on particularly the situation in the IIOJK, particularly in the context of colonialism, the way the state of India, particularly in Kashmir, has orchestrated the entire thing in the background of colonialism. I would just begin with this, that the entire strategies, the plans, the way the Indian state has responded towards people of Kashmir, and particularly on the various aspects, is a manifestation of one thing, that the relationship between the two communities, particularly between the government of India and the people of Jammu and Kashmir, is the relationship of oppressed and oppressor. I mean, there is no denying of this fact that the entire situation revolves around between among these two parties, as the binary is the colonial, a person who is colonized and a person who is colonizing. Now, when we say about the colonialism in the context of Kashmir, everywhere, I mean, if we see that this is generally justified by what the earlier speakers also mentioned, by language and discourse. If we see Dr. Vasi has rightly said about mentioned about British experience of here in subcontinent, and even then, if we see there, the idea was that the broader tagline was that we are here on a civilization mission of wild, particularly natives. They used to use these jargons. Now, another factor which has also been added in the colonial this strategy is, of course, the strategy of development, where you develop people, you bring the developmental projects. Under that garb, you of course do the agenda of the colonialism, or you colonize people and other things. Now, when it comes to Kashmir, we can also draw some parallels. People are also talking about Palestine and other conflicts. If you see that, simultaneously, of course, there has been political, economic, social, and other angles, but there has been one of the important thing, which is that the way the narrative of victimhood created by Indian state particularly, and that also justified the argument of self-defense, that is something very, very important to note. I mean, if you see that how they try to legitimize the violence, particularly in the context of IIOJK, by coming up with the narrative of victimhood, particularly if we see that some areas like Pandits, particularly if you see, there is no denying of the fact, rooting out of communities from their homes, or any community divide of religion. I mean, if they have suffered, that is very, very wrong and grave. But if you weaponize the pen particularly, and then try to divide the communities, just to anchor your own agenda of colonialism, and just to divide communities, that is one of the very dangerous trick, I must say, that has been operationalized, and that has been put into place in Kashmir, particularly when it comes to the communities. Now, on the other side, if you see that when India abrogated Article 370, I mean, the narrative of the language and the discourse which has been created, that we see that try to portray themselves as the rightful owner of Kashmir and its land, and try to normalize violence through language and discourse by giving it the justifying it through self-defense, maybe something in the defense, violence in the defense, or violence perpetrated under the name of protecting the larger communities. Now, on the other side, we've also seen that once they're weaponized, their pen is weaponized, and certain things like for the Pandits, if we see, we call that there is a new terminology like Punun Kashmir is the only possible choice for them. Now, what happened is you try to bring in the victimhood, you try to justify the violence, and you try to legitimize and legalize actually division among the communities. That is one of the idea, I guess, the whole theory of segregating the communities that is in play there. On the other side, there is one on political side, as it is mentioned. We also see that if just let's imagine this delimitation commission thing, how it has divided both communities in further segregated communities, political parties, particularly if you see NC, if you see PDP, if you see other Gupkar delegation and other, there's a very deliberate and very thoughtful attempt to further alienate, divide communities so that the broader idea of bringing in the mainstream Indian politics and political agenda of BJP into the Kashmir can be flourished or can be justified. On the other side, if you see even the communities, I mean, there is no denying of the fact that communities should get right. But the way even people of the communities like Gujars and Bakarwals contesting that they should be included in scheduled tribes, STs, or scheduled caste or not, that has further alienated in communities at the very grassroots level as well. Particularly, this also happened in, if you see, it has further created resentment, particularly if you see in other areas like Ladakh. We see the Ladakh Hill Development Council Act that was passed in 1997. And then what happened is now after the abrogation, there's a stronger demand of statehood again. So what is happening at some places, communities are further reducing themselves to a very narrow region, bringing more identities up. So largely diluting the identity, Kashmiri identity, what we can say politically as well. So this is also a very thoughtful attempt that's happening, and under the garb of this grabbing the entire power and, you know, sort of squeezing the spaces for people who resent or dissent. On the other side, even for the sake of, if you see the strategy about media, sort of intimidating journalists, criminalizing journalism, or I mean free press, particularly if you see that many journalists have been, you know, arrested, summoned, and intimidated after carrying, you know, critical reports against the particular version of the government. So this also is one of the important thing, that the spaces on the free press on the other side has been also been squeezed, with, of course, with a view that how the entire agenda of the BJP, particularly to dominate that region with certain perspective, can be done. Last thing I must say that of course there is a lot of if we see heralding of illegal settlement of Palestine when it comes to the BJP people, which is very sad. I mean, you can't support the violent, supporting the violent dispossession of Palestinian, particularly from the land, and publicly chanting that we will implement these sort of apartheid policies over here as well, is of course it is also reflected in everyday humiliation of people or dehumanization what we see over there. So this also is a matter of grave concern for people of Kashmir particularly. So on the whole, if we see that this is sort of an incremental approach towards colonization of Kashmir, from cultural as said, political on the other side, you see that administratively, and you also see that on a larger scale. So multiple strategies have been in play, and the only thing I guess which is the important thing is the resistance element of Kashmir, that there's a greater awareness and understanding, may it be on domicile law, may it be on language thing, may it be on political division, may it be on geographical and delimitation, all these things. There is a informed debate and understanding of people of Jammu and Kashmir particularly, that how this entire thing is unfolding, and the resistance of people, of course, against this thing is very much there, which is of course quite challenging. And I guess over the period of time, when you don't answer the political question, a political question has to be answered politically, so it further complicates. So I personally see that this agenda will further I guess complex the entire issue of Jammu and Kashmir, but hardly could bring development, hardly could integrate communities, and hardly could mainstream this overall agenda of suppression or colonialism. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Dr. Vikas, for your contribution. We have a short video, and after that I will go to Mr. Ahmed Qureshi. Ahmed Qureshi is a journalist in Pakistan, Gulf and MENA regions. He worked as a war correspondent in Lebanon, Syria, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan for international media. Qureshi has delivered different lectures on the situation of Yemen, Iraq, and that of Kashmir at international forums and also at United Nations Geneva. So first of all, we will have the short documentary. Then I will straight go to Ahmed Qureshi, and Ahmed Qureshi will enlighten us how we can counter the propaganda of the Indian cinema, the way the Indian movie Current Days in Discussion, the Kashmir Files, how it can be, how they have made it, and how we can counter this narrative, and what should be our course of action. So first of all, this video, please.
This war with Pakistan, we went to the Security Council.
Finally, Nehru approaches the United Nations. Article 370 is incorporated in the Indian Constitution, a key feature in the Kashmir-India relationship. It provided a reasonable autonomy to the state while making it a part of the Indian Union. But there were political activists in the country who saw it as a threat to India.
370 हटने से विकास का रास्ता सबके लिए खुला हो गया।
Kashmir has been a conflict zone for decades. It's Friday, on the streets of Kashmir's largest city. Indian authorities are working hard to keep a lid on displays like this. But they can't change how people feel. Indian forces have used pellet guns to quell unrest in Kashmir.
सात लाख फौज है इधर। किस लिए रखा 7 लाख फौज? रखवाली करने के लिए। वो कहाँ रखवाली करता? वो मारता। हमारे बच्चे कोई सेफ नहीं है।
And the Indian Army's one-off ploy of using a local man as a human shield to control a stone-pelting riot last year, the road to peace looks nearly non-existent. They have caused injuries that have permanently disabled many victims, reinforcing the feeling that Kashmiris are just collateral damage.
Questioned people and found some arms. But these people have given human rights investigators a more harrowing account of what took place. They say the men of the village were taken from their homes and tortured.
Barbaric killings and forced abductions made mockery of India's dubious secular conscience. It is true, my sufferings mark all violations of human rights. But it is also true that no matter how hard the journey may be, my steps were never broken.
Thank you. This was a short video prepared by our intern Anisa Nabi. Now I will go to Mr. Ahmed Qureshi for the valuable inputs. Mr. Qureshi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vani, and very honored to join this very distinguished panel. And after listening to 5 very distinguished members of the academia, it only makes sense to listen to a less academic observations coming from a journalist, really, from a non-academic background. And I just really have 3 or 4 very quick observations, which I would like to share just to add to the discussion before we conclude. First is the fact that there's an observation, which is Kashmiri journalism has been empowered in these last 5 years like never before by circumstance, which is an irony, because on the one hand, Kashmiri journalism faces unprecedented restrictions inside Indian occupied Kashmir and inside mainland India. But on the other hand, the events that unfolded after 5 August 2019 also led to unprecedented empowerment, how it led to the international focus, the renewed international focus on Kashmir situation resulted in providing Kashmiri journalists new platforms to highlight their activism and the plight of their homeland in ways that never happened before. I think we all know how most of the Kashmiri journalists usually had access either to Kashmiri media inside Indian occupied Kashmir or to platforms in India. And post, I would say 2016, gradually and specifically after 2019, we've seen tremendous interest by the international media and media organizations in Kashmiri journalism, and as maybe in some ways as gestures of solidarity with fellow journalists, or as attempts to highlight human rights violations, more and more Kashmiri journalists were given platforms beyond Kashmiri media and beyond Indian media, in the international media, whether it is in the Middle East or in Turkey or in Europe or in North America. So this is an irony of sorts, where you have unprecedented suppression of Kashmiri journalism, but at the same time, there's unprecedented empowerment. I'll come to the result of that in a few seconds. But before that, let me just add another part, which is unprecedented also diplomatic setbacks for India. And there are many over the last 5 years. If we take the 2 UN unprecedented 2 UN reports on Kashmir in 2018 and 19, and then move on to the unprecedented 2 hearings in US Congress on Kashmir, the hearings on the situation in Kashmir in the British Parliament, in the French Parliament, the European Parliament, and then move on to how Kashmir was highlighted on a couple of occasions in the G7 meeting in France, and also in the 2, after a long time, in the 2 closed-door sessions on Kashmir in the UN Security Council. A number of diplomatic setbacks. The latest, of course, was the meeting of the foreign ministers, the Council of Foreign Ministers of the OIC, the world's 2nd largest multilateral organization in Islamabad, Pakistan. I went through the some of the decisions that were taken. Of course, I think the number of resolutions passed in this CFM OIC far exceeded any number of decisions taken in any other CFM in the 50-year history of the OIC. The part of those resolutions pertaining to Kashmir are dramatic in their long-term effect. And I will not go through the list, of course, right now. They're available online on the OIC website. But suffice to say that there are unprecedented diplomatic setbacks for India as far as diplomacy is concerned when it comes to Kashmir in these last 5 years. Again, and this leads me to the 3rd point observation, which is this empowerment of Kashmiri journalism internationally and the diplomatic setbacks. How and when will they be translated into actual tangible results and movement on conflict resolution in Kashmir? And that's the area where we're on a standstill. By no means I claim to know an answer to this or can analyze it better than anyone else can. But I just wanted to highlight these 2 points, that we have this empowerment of Kashmiri journalism, we have these diplomatic setbacks, and we're standing at a point where we need to translate all of this into diplomatic movement on conflict resolution, which is a huge challenge. And this leads me to the last point, which is we have this unprecedented diplomatic situation where over the last 3 years, we see India repeatedly getting itself into a corner on Kashmir, and somehow something happens in the world that somehow helps the Indian government get out of that tight corner. For example, recently after the 5 August illegal actions, we saw immediately the lockdowns, the pandemic, somehow partially helped the Indian government absorb some of the pressure that came on India through the international media. And then now, of course, we have the international media being distracted by the conflict, the crisis, the war in Ukraine. All of these things really basically come to serve. And of course, then we have the situation in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan, pandemic, Ukraine, all of these things came really and we saw an immediate impact of that. For example, the UN was released a Kashmir report in 2018, another report in 2019. There was nothing in 2020, of course, the year of the pandemic, nothing in 2021, mainly because the world got distracted because of the pandemic, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. Somehow these things are coming up, to help the Indian government. Just an observation, really. It's adds to the challenge of human rights defenders and journalists and people in the academia, really, who are shedding light on the situation in Kashmir. And I would like to conclude these very quick observations with the point on the film, which is the Kashmir Files. Of course, obviously, the short answer to how to counter this kind of narrative is very simple, is to counter it by producing a counter movie that would negate the impact of this film. But that's possible, definitely. But I'm really not concerned about the impact of this film. The impact of the Indian film industry remains really limited, although it's an amazing, huge film industry that impacts hundreds of millions of people, a huge portion of the global population, but it remains limited really to the populations of India and South Asia, and to a certain extent the Middle East. The Middle East part is more focused really on the entertainment side of the Indian film industry, and not on the preaching side of the Indian film industry or the political side of the Indian film industry. That part really impacts the Indian citizens and other citizens of South Asia more. I do not mean to undermine it. It is still very serious thing, because when it impacts these kind of films, harden the positions of millions of Indian citizens, and sow the seeds of conflict for a long time to come. So it's by no means to be taken lightly, definitely, and need to be countered. I was just referring to the global impact. Maybe it's not as much. But having said all of that, I cannot underestimate the impact of such soft projection of Indian government's positions in Kashmir through the film industry. It's still lethal, and it does have an impact, even if not globally in a large way, but in some ways these kind of films get coverage in the media and so forth. So just very quick observations from a journalistic point of view, coming after these very interesting observations from the academic side. And I just would like to highlight what Sayyid Muhammad Ali said, which resonates with me as well. The comparison he made Kashmir and Palestine, by no means, of course, to undermine or underestimate the suffering of our Palestinian friends, tremendous suffering, no question about that. But it is true that the humanitarian and political urgency of Kashmir conflict is far beyond and exceeds, to my understanding, maybe aside from the situation that we see right now in Ukraine, probably, but it far exceeds any other humanitarian situation globally at this moment, for the reasons very eloquently explained by Sayyid Muhammad Ali. And I think this is a very important point to highlight. Why? Because although there's often comparison made between the situation in the Palestinian territories and Kashmir, the fact remains that the magnitude of suffering in Kashmir, the magnitude of the tragedy in Kashmir, the magnitude of territory involved in Kashmir, and the consequences of global powers, of major powers, regional powers, India, Pakistan, China, and by extension, probably the United States and maybe even Russia being involved. All of that makes Kashmir really very, very urgent, but mainly makes it very, very urgent on a humanitarian ground, much, much more in terms of the suffering of Kashmiri women and children, the families, and the overall situation on the ground. So with this, I conclude my intervention. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Qureshi Sahab, for your intervention. You rightly pointed out towards the resolutions passed by the OIC and others, the non-action on behalf of the Human Rights Council, and you must be knowing that the only link between the ground and the United Nations was the coalition of civil society, who is led by Kurum Parvez. Last year in 2020, his office was raided and all their documents were confiscated, and thereafter they were not able to report on the situation. And that's why the United Nations Human Rights Council did not have the on-ground information of the happenings in Kashmir. Though we tried a lot from our part to send the communications and all that, earned us a lot of communication, at least 13 of the communications from the United Nations Special Procedures, the government of India. But as you said about the one important thing which comes to my mind is that though the foreign ministers, Council of Foreign Ministers passed the resolutions which were sort of encouraging fact, but at the same time we see some of the our Muslim friends, they are visiting Kashmir, they are trying to invest in Kashmir in order to normalize, in order to protect the economic interests of the Indians who are there. That must be taken into consideration, and we must focus on that also. Why is it happening? If it did not happen for last 73 years, why at this point of time? This is a point of concern for all of us. On one hand, we have the resolution, but on the same day, we see a group of investors from the UAE and Hong Kong visiting, not Hong Kong, Vietnam visiting the Indian occupied Kashmir. This is a point of concern, and we should focus on it. And about the journalists, you talked about journalists, we got a lot of coverage and all that. But this brought us to the point that though we got the coverage in the media, international media, earlier in 2019 and in 2020, but with the passage of time, we failed to get the same kind of coverage in that media. That's also a point to be thought and to be researched on what has happened and how it happened. Is it all because of the current crisis which are taking place around the globe, or it is something in action by the governments at the international level? We don't see any action, any condemnation from the international governments of the government of India for revoking Article 370 and thereby putting a lockdown on Kashmir, and thereby what we have to are very serious points, and we need to call upon the authorities in Pakistan also on the Foreign Minister and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to look into all these things so that a better environment is created at international level. You see, what we can do, we create, at the end of the day, our message is carried out by the civil society around the globe. But the message which needs to be conveyed is to the governments at international level, because the Council or the UN and other bodies, there are political bodies, and those decisions are taken there. I think Qureshi wants to say something.
Yes, Mr. Chair. I think we have a question from one of the attendees.
Yeah.
Miss Hafsa Khan, she has a question. So if you have, just a couple of minutes, maybe we can take the question.
I will see what is the question. Thank you, Hafsa Khan. I don't see the question. What is the question?
No, she raised her hand.
Huh?
She raised her hand. She raised her hand.
Okay, Hafsa Khan, continue with your question.
Actually, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I typed my question in the Q&A section, so if you could just read it out and discuss it, I would be very grateful.
Yeah, you can ask your question now.
Yeah, I've read the question. Can I respond to it, Vanisa?
Yeah, sure.
Basically, what she has asked is her understanding.
Can I just read out my question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm really sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to read it out. So my question is that by tacit agreement, the military establishments of India and Pakistan seem to have recognized the LOC as an international boundary. Why don't Pakistani political and military analysts criticize the country's eager embrace of realpolitik in this regard? It's also important to underscore that this paradigm shift came after 9/11. Yeah.
Can I briefly respond to it, Vanessa?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Hafsa, for your question. Let me remind you and clarify that there is no tacit understanding or agreement between India and Pakistan. I've actually only an hour ago was part of a track too. There is no such understanding, and the empirical evidence of that, Pakistan's continued and long-standing emphasis as in terms of international law and international diplomacy, the primary locus standi is the UN Security Council resolutions, which describe Kashmir as Jammu and Kashmir as a disputed territory, which and the final resolution being based on the right of plebiscite being given to the Kashmiri people. So obviously, you cannot expect Pakistani and Indian military to have any understanding which is in conflict with the international legal and diplomatic stance that Pakistan has consistently maintained at all bilateral and multilateral forums. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from any side? Mr. Qureshi, I have a question for you.
Yes, and I think we also have a question from Mr. Hamza Shahryar.
Hamza Shahryar, what's his question? Hamza, you there? Yes, Hamza, unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sir, my question is to Mr. Vikas Ali Kausar. As we see that Israel's efforts to make demographic changes in Palestine, same alike India also did. So my point of concern is that with all the administrative support in terms of domicile allowance and security shortages by Indian Army in the state, will Hindus will be able to be a part of Kashmiri state and get the citizenship? The main point of my question is that will Kashmiris will allow them to be settled over there?
Thank you. Hamza, I mean, the efforts have been there after particularly 5th of August, and particularly when it comes to the domicile law, we have repeatedly been praising voice, reading a lot that they have issued domicile to many people, those who are living, I mean, outside the state subject, particularly the word which we use. The laws have been changed in a way that many people who are doing jobs there, those who've been stayed there for some time, I guess they will automatically fall into that category. The fundamental question is, the challenge particularly is that the granting the domicile thing is one, but on the other side, how this social assimilation, acceptance happens, that's a fundamental question and challenge. In my opinion, it won't happen because of the 2-3 reasons. First, if we see the history of this entire conflict, the relationship between the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and particularly when it comes to the governments, those who've been in India ruling governments, that has never been a relationship of sort of a cordial relationship. It has been always has been a relationship of oppressor and oppressed, to be honest. The overall, if you see the dilemma which society is undergoing, I mean, the various segments of the society, the people, if you see the gender perspective, I mean, it has a deep grievances. The pain is deep. The communities, particularly those who have been victim of suppression, their pain is so much that I guess the accepting that thing of somebody from outside Kashmir, particularly backed by state, is something which is nearly impossible to me. Last thing, I guess, even the political parties, those who have been pro-Indian, what we call, I mean, if you call PDP, if you call NC and other, I mean, this is one of the things where still there is a unanimous consensus that this thing is changing the demographic of Kashmir, also cost them politically as well. So I guess keeping this entire thing in mind, of course, the BJP government particularly will want this to issue and change the demographic and whatever they want. I mean, they have stated openly to install a BJP chief minister, maybe with a certain particular religion outside the Muslim community. They will try, but overall the environment, the social environment, particularly even the political resistance for that matter, and even on the broader the political landscape of the Kashmir and the Kashmiri communities, I guess won't accept this and won't happen in long term. If you create very secluded, isolated communities, that you can do administratively and on the basis of your security, but bringing people together, making it a part of society, to have a sustainable sort of living and making it a part of society, it will be very, very difficult in future, I guess.
Thank you, sir. Thank
you. Thank you, Dr. Vikas, for your response to this question. I was about to talk to Mr. Qureshi, as Qureshi deals with the media more. You said its impact is very short, but recently we have seen that one of the states in Maryland in the United States, their Senate has approved this documentary and has called it that this genocide took place. This is small happening. If this continues in the Western world, the way this movie is being screened everywhere, so it will have an external impact also. So that needs to be countered. That's very important. Along with that, what you rightly said, that millions of people in India, they are after the Muslims now after this. So, but what can we do at the international level? Because you have to counter the international perspective of it.
Yes,
for the Qureshi Saab, just want to add one thing before you answer. I mean, the sort of reaction of this particularly on Kashmir files, I mean, maybe one can think on that communities divide of religion. I mean, no matter from where they come, if they are marginalized, if they are brutalized, if they have, suffered, the fundamental idea of entire this Kashmir thing, even the movement is the people, it should be a people-centric, and it is a people-centric and believes on sentiments. But if we weaponize the pain, that's something I guess is that point have to be countered, because at the end of the day, Kashmiri Pandits, they were very much part of that society, and they should be assimilated, that they can be brought back. But if you use them as a tool to legitimize your own colonial design, that is something need to be challenged. Otherwise, they live there for centuries, and communities and people have a very greater relationship with each other. So maybe these things we need to put in perspective when we counter this argument as well, that as a human, how we can hate people on the basis of religion. That's never meant for Kashmiri society. It's very inclusive society.
Raisa?
Yes, I agree, Dr. Waqas. And to answer the question, Wali Saab, I think for the first time, we also saw in these last 5 years, and specifically after 5 August 2019, we've seen the Kashmiri diaspora organize itself in new ways. For example, the hearings that took place in the US Congress, 2 hearings on Kashmir, and the 1 hearing in the British Parliament, and specifically I will refer to the 2 hearings in the US Congress. We saw Kashmiri activists come out in ways that we have not seen happen before. The level and concentration of Kashmiri activism and Kashmiri voices coming forward and stepping forward and talking about the situation inside Kashmir in an educated way has shifted in a very tangible way, in a positive way, and that's for example, for anyone right now who would like to read educated Kashmiri assessment in a language that speaks to a global audience, the transcripts of the hearings, the 2 hearings in the US Congress provide a treasure trove of points and arguments and ideas by a diverse community of Kashmiri activists that includes Kashmiri Muslims, Kashmiri Hindus, Kashmiri Sikhs, and Kashmiris who are from the academia, Kashmiris who are probably in more contact, who have family inside Indian occupied Kashmirs, and Kashmiris who probably have lost touch with the ground in Kashmir, but they're still emotionally attached and living in diaspora outside in countries such as, for example, the United States. So the countering of a film like Kashmir Files is definitely, I agree with you, Anisa, it's very essential, cannot be underestimated. And how to do it is for the Kashmiris to get more and better organized. And that's happening. Luckily, that's happening. We're seeing that happen. And we also see many friends of the Kashmiris actually joining in and helping Kashmiris really shape their voice and arguments in a way and a manner and a language that speaks to a global audience.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Thank you so much. I think Qureshi Saab has made very important and valuable contribution to this discussion. Just 2 points I want to share. Objectively and unemotionally, as a student of strategic communication, I'll give you 2 examples. A small community of Jews have made a narrative of Holocaust almost as a global blasphemy in the Western world. So what's going on in Kashmir is like a Kashmiri Holocaust. Why can't the Kashmiri diaspora in the West develop a similar, stronger, united narrative on this? Number one. And I think the point that Qureshi Saab made is the central one and fundamental, to be organized. That is the most important fundamental requirement, is for the Kashmiri diaspora to be organized. So that I was listening to the farewell speech of the outgoing Pakistani ambassador in Washington, Asad Majid Saab, and he made a profound comment in this context. And this is not specific to Kashmir, but he was also talking about the Pakistani community as well. That the problem is some people have money, some have influence, some have knowledge, some have ideas, but we need to organize and consolidate these resources. That is very important, so that this voice becomes stronger, more sophisticated, more influential, not just on the Hill, but also in the Beltway, but also in the think tanks and academia. And it I think needs to be reinforced. The great work that people like yourself, Vani Saab and Qureshi Saab are doing is very important. But I think it deserves adequate and sustainable support and reinforcement from academic and media. How? Just 2-3 specific examples. If you think about, I don't know how many Kashmiri, I mean, there's a lot of Kashmiri diaspora in the UK. How many, one of my class fellows actually in the PhD program, she did a fantastic study. I mean, her PhD thesis was on the role of Kashmiri diaspora in Kashmir issue. So I think similar efforts need to be made by the Kashmiri diaspora who are intellectually oriented, that if they're doing PhD programs and they're doing research and they're writing books, they can explore and do research on different aspects of the Kashmir issue. I, in my initial comments, mentioned 5 dimensions of the colonization of Kashmir. It's economic, political, security, cultural, and information. So all these dimensions, there can be books written, well-researched work done on each aspect of this. Secondly, I think, not on a pessimistic note, but I think social media arms people, it informs them, and it gives them voice. I mean, 57 to 58% of the world population is on social media. So, I mean, now you can give your voice, make a short video and, share it all over the world. So these 2 things, I think, need to be understood. And lastly, if just look at the Ukraine crisis as a case study, it's been just 4 weeks, Qureshi Saab. See how effectively and smartly the Ukraine government has shaped the narrative. On the other side, militarily, Russia is much stronger. There is no comparison between the military might of Russia. But in the information domain, you will probably agree, as an information expert, Qureshi Saab, how the narrative is so hostile and dominated by the anti-Russia perspective, a very sophisticated manner, and how it was galvanized and organized in the last 4 months, giving hope and confidence to the Ukrainian people as if they are fighting, the invading Mongols or whatever, and Russia has immediately turned into an evil empire. So I think the Kashmiris have a lot of facts, but they need to interestingly and in a sophisticated and impressive manner put their story across in all the mediums. Thank you.
Thank you, Sayyid Mohammad Ali Saab. Dr. Wasi Saab, you want to add something? Unmute yourself.
Yes, I can add to this the point that has just been made by Mohammad Ali Saab, that I think that a communication strategy that is required to be framed, but that should not be limited to only English language. I think we need to create literature in other languages, Spanish, French, German, in other languages. We need to create that literature. Second thing is that so far our narrative is largely diplomatic oriented and political oriented. Now we are talking about this movie that is being staged there in India. The number of pundits, they are quite less as compared to the Muslim majority people living in J&K, but their creative output is quite limited, both in fictional literature as well as non-fictional literature. They have produced a film which is getting very popular. There are a number of other factors also. So we need to move beyond the traditional approach that we are following. We need to create movies documentaries, dramas, plays, and such type of creative works that we need to produce. That is very important. That I think that we need to include. Recently, I was hearing Mirza Waid, who produced The Collaborator. He was saying that we have been doing journalism for 18, 20 years, but nobody was listening to us. Nobody was paying heed to whatever stories that we are writing. But once I wrote The Collaborator, once I wrote the Book of Gold List, everybody started paying attention to that. So I think that we need to create, we need to work upon that, on this aspect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Vasi. This reminds me of that you talked about that we should produce literature not only in English but in different languages. This reminds me of one of my experiences in Jordan. I was in Jordan in 2016, I think. So I met a lot of people, some of people who had achieved their education from Pakistan, doctors, engineers, and professors who were students, and they had a union over there, Pakistan-Jordan Friendship Club. And they told me that we know what Pakistan is and what Pakistan has done for Palestine and people and for the Gulf. But our children don't know, because India is in our kitchen. India is in our drawing room. They have encroached in our drawing room through this Indian cinema and movies with Arabic language and all that. We have been telling our people in Pakistani friends that we should produce such films with the Arabic script and all that, so that our people can know, our children can know about India. It's true that we are lacking this, and we have been telling to the power corridors and all those who matter that this needs to be done. Unfortunately, on this part, we still don't have a proper strategy on this. As far as the diaspora is concerned, Ahmed, you spoke about that there were two hearings in the American Congress in 2019 and in 2020. I think those the people from the Indian occupied Kashmir, the influential people, the human rights defenders, are the people who are in different capacities working there. But what we saw after that, the reprisals against their families back at home, and they also stopped coming forward. They say, okay, we will give you money, but we are not coming forward. We are not showing our faces, because then our families back home. Because India has to open each and every space for this. But it's for, I think, we people who are here, or the people from Azad Kashmir and Pakistan who are at international level. I think the people from occupied Kashmir can support them through information and all these things. But it's the people from here, we have to make our people intellectually sound so that they will create these spaces at international level. That is to be done, and that needs to be done, and that is the urgency of the time. Ahmed, you again want to say something?
Yes, I was just reading some of the questions, and Ms. Hafsa had a follow-up to the question which was answered by Sayyid Muhammad Ali and also by myself. But her follow-up is something that might be of interest to you, Wani Saab, and also to Wasi Saab and Dr. Waqar and also Sayyid Muhammad Ali. Let me just read it very quickly. It's a very short one. It says, she's writing and she says, Pakistan is exercising strategic restraint on the LOC, but this is a radical departure from our pre-9/11 policy. And I'd be obliged if this could be explained. And since I'm reading the question, if I may take the liberty of very quickly, just making a quick comment on this and to see if anybody would like to answer it. Obviously, Pakistan has not said that it's exercising strategic restraint on the LOC, but yes, we have a truce, a ceasefire on the LOC. And pre-9/11, that's 20 years, 2 decades. Obviously, lots of things have changed. I think the ceasefire right now on the LOC is a need for both India and Pakistan, thanks to the tremendous diplomatic and political pressure, specifically that we saw after the ill-advised Indian strategic blunder of Balakot and sending the Indian Air Force jets inside Pakistan to attack targets, and the resultant diplomatic and political pressure that came from friends of both India and Pakistan. after that episode, specifically the ceasefire on LOC, or to use another term, strategic restraint on LOC, has become a need for both India and also for Pakistan. So I think it would be unfair to compare the situation pre, or whether it's a departure really from a pre-9/11 policy. Things have changed on the ground 2 decades down the road. And yes, we can use the term strategic restraint. Maybe Pakistan is exercising it, and maybe India is exercising it as well. But for how long, and how long can it last? And can this be really a replacement for a durable conflict resolution? That's another question.
Thank you.
If anybody would like to answer this.
Ali Mohammed Saab, sir, your response.
I'll just say I don't think that the term strategic restraint is between India and Pakistan is related or Kashmir specific. Obviously, Madam Hafsa, you'll appreciate the fact that both countries are nuclear powers, and it is a common interest to prevent a nuclear war between these two countries. However, what is also very important is the popular sentiment within IIOJK, which has been consistent, which has been determined, and their voices, their grievances, and their lack of trust, and their hatred, and their defiance of the Indian operation and occupation is also very growing. So I think Pakistan's strategic options are not constrained, but I think the Kashmiris' aspirations and their concerns and their determination to seek independence from the military occupation of India are two different things. But we really appreciate that and continue to provide political, diplomatic, legal, and moral support to that, and will continue to do that. And I think the recent OIC and exceptionally successful, as Qureshi Saab also said, Foreign Ministers Conference, and also the Chinese reiteration, which really angered the Indians this time, despite the fact that he is in New Delhi today. Also must have been noticed, and I think Kashmiris need to acknowledge and appreciate that.
Thank you. I think we will end with this good note that Pakistan will continue to support the people of Kashmir, and the defiance of the people of Kashmir against India and his hatred towards India is so much that they will continue their struggle, and the world powers at one point of time will have to make India accountable of its crimes against humanity in occupied Kashmir, and provide the basis for a settlement of the Kashmir dispute through a free and fair plebiscite. I thank you all for your wonderful inputs. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Great to join you. Thank you, Wani Saab.
Thank you, Wani Saab. Pleasure to be here. And thank you, Qureshi Saab. Thank you, Wasi Saab, for shukriya.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all. Please.